I would agree with probably almost everything you said as far as the state of the church and where things are. I mean, I literally wrote a book, Deadly Indifference, about the whole problem with religious indifference. I have a whole chapter on the Assisi, and I detail how I admit to a affection and love for JP2, but I detail very clearly that the Assisi event was not some aberration for him. It was the most clear, most obvious, most kind of out there. But if you look at all, I actually went through all his addresses to Muslim groups, to non-Catholic groups, and never once in any of them did he ever say, hey, why don't you become Catholic? In a papal way, of course. But he never did that. And in fact, he said numerous times things that a Muslim listening to it of goodwill and just open heart would take to mean I can remain Muslim and the Pope thinks it's okay. I mean, so clearly that's scandalous. I think what it comes down to is when it comes to the necessity defense, I look at it a little bit like the just war theory. If you're going to disobey the Pope, it's kind of like the just war theory. Just war theory is war is the absolute last resort. You have to try everything, anything and everything before you start firing bullets and, launching missiles and things like that. And I would say the same thing is true of disobeying an order from the Pope. I'm not saying you never disobey an order from the Pope, because St. Thomas Aquinas makes it very clear that we have absolute obedience is due to God alone. No man demands our absolute obedience on this earth. So you can disobey a Pope at times, but it's it's the last resort, especially for a bishop, especially when it comes to something like this. We're talking about the consecration of other bishops. So we're talking about the hierarchical nature of the church, the sacramental nature of the church, all these different, I know that bishop isn't a new sacrament, but the point is it touches on fundamental aspects of the church. And so for me, it has to be the absolute last resort. And when I look at what happened, yes, I look at, the fact that it's clear, and God rest his soul, I love Ratzinger too. It's clear the Ratzinger, with JP2's approval, was stringing Lefebvre along. I mean, there's no question about that. But ultimately, like you even said, Nicholas, it came down to a lot of it came down to dates. And there was some debate about who you could consecrate a bishop. There was, the Vatican wanted to pick their guy. Lefebvre was like, no, I don't really want your guy as their bishop. But ultimately, that's another reason, though, why you don't do it. Because if you are debating about dates, you make sure, just take a step back for the dates. In May, early May, there was the agreement signed, that said, yes, you can consecrate a bishop in principle. And then Lefebvre basically realized, or in his view, okay, this isn't really, I'm not getting what I want. This isn't exactly, they're just kind of stringing along some more. So he went back on it. And then they said, well, we could do it on, he said, let's do it on June 30th. He said, no, how about August 15th? Then he ended up doing it on June 30th. I would just say, what's the harm of waiting till August 15th? I realize he was not in the greatest of health, and you don't know when your time is going to come, but he could have just waited till August 15th, see what happens then. The point is, you make it very clear. You continue to do all these things to make it clear that you will leave no stone unturned to obey the Pope. And I feel like this is the reason I feel kind of strongly about this, even though I have very good views of the SSPX and the people I know in the SSPX, all that, and the work they do. I have strong views on this because I feel like it applies to our time today, even more so, because I don't want trads to have a knee-jerk reaction to we can disobey Pope Francis because of X, Y, Z that he does. Because ultimately, he's still a legitimate Pope. And I do think now, God bless Archbishop Lefebvre. He never, of course, went into sedevacantism. But I do feel like it gives a certain amount of credence to sedevacantists, like a Vigano, because, in fact, Vigano himself has invoked Lefebvre as his model. And when you start to disobey the Pope, I think that sets a precedent to you stop to acknowledge him as the Pope. And again, Lefebvre obviously never did that. The society has never done that. The society bishops, to my knowledge, the four bishops, and of course, Bishop Williamson, God rest his soul, just recently passed. But the point is that it does give that model, and that's why you don't do it. That's one of the reasons why you don't do it. You want to make sure every stone has been unturned before you would do something like disobey a direct order from the Pope.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a distinction in moral theology between disobedience and schism that you kind of alluded to in your presentation, that I wish more people knew online, because I feel like I wouldn't be having to constantly respond to people who just continue to throw out things like schism. They're not excommunicated anymore, but they're in schism. Somehow that works. I don't understand how that works. But yeah, in moral theology, it's clear. Schism is a particular sin where it's a refusal to submit to the Roman pontiff, principally because he is the Roman pontiff. So in other words, it's like, Dad, I'm not going to listen to you because you're dad, right? I just refuse to accept that you're dad at all and that you have any authority. I'm going to kind of go and do my own thing. Archbishop Lefebvre recognized that, therefore, disobedience was something grave and therefore had to constitute that state of necessity to justify his actions. I think when we take a look at the historical timeline, what do we see? We see, on the one hand, you're right, there is this dealing and he is being strung along. But often when you look at the details, we see that the dates continuously change. The first date that's put forward by Ratzinger and that was agreed to by Lefebvre, ironically, was the traditional feast of Christ the King, but then it got moved back as the date proceeded. This happened some 2 or 3 times. So I'm thinking in Lefebvre's mind, what he's thinking is, especially as an old man, we're going to specific dates, but yet they continuously are pushing it back because there's kind of the wheeling and dealing of, I want my particular bishop versus I want my particular bishop. And so I think in Lefebvre's mind, he recognizes that he is legitimately being strung along. And look who he's being strung along by. He's being strung along by gentlemen who are at the same time actively witnessing and oftentimes pushing forward the auto-destruction of the faith itself. I mean, we're talking about, for instance, because I agree with you, it's like we need to obey the Pope. But then in this context, it's like this Pope is praying with snake worshipers. Like this Pope has Hindu priestesses dancing around him, and so this is not Saint Pius X. This is something kind of crazy. So he's trying his best, but then he realizes they're not interested in Catholic tradition flourishing anymore. And I think it's important for people to recognize kind of the context of this legally. So Canon 1323 is the canon that we oftentimes talk about when we're discussing this subject. Canon 1323. And in Canon 1323, Section 4 and Section 7 are kind of the pertinent sections when debating the supposed excommunications. So as an example, what I'll just read for you because I have it pulled up on my notes, the canon itself. So it says right here in Canon 1323, it says this, quote, "No one is liable to a penalty who, when violating the law or precept, one of these things." So the first one, you're not 16 years of age. Okay, so Lefebvre is not 16, right? 2, was without fault ignorant of violating the law or precept, inadvertence, an error equivalent to ignorance. So in other words, you're not ignorant that you're about to break this thing. If you were ignorant, of course, you would not be excommunicated. 3, acted under physical force, right? So no one can physically force you to do something that's against canon law, and therefore you be excommunicated. But then number 4 is the pertinent one. It says this, right? So you're not excommunicated if acted under the compulsion of grave fear, if even if only relative, or by reason of necessity or grave inconvenience, unless, however, the act is intrinsically evil or tends to be harmful to souls. And what's interesting about this is that in subsection 7 it says, though through no personal fault, that some of the circumstances existed that are mentioned in Numbers 4 and 5. What does all of this fancy jargon mean for the average viewer? In other words, canon 4 or subsection 4 of this canon is very, very clear. If Lefebvre is someone who is compulsed by grave fear, even if it's only relative, even if he only thinks that there is a grave fear, such as the Roman authorities are stringing me along, they're not clearly pushing for the traditional Catholic faith. Whether that's true or not, even if that's not true for sake of story, even if he thought it was, right, he would not be liable to excommunication. And so what I think is interesting about this canon is that, for instance, if you don't think that there is a crisis, he clearly had grave fear, and therefore he acted under those stipulations. One other final note that I'll mention, this is interesting for people. The excommunication in canon law for consecrating a bishop, it's not underneath the section of the unity of the church, sins against the unity of the church, which is very interesting because that's where you see sins of schism, sins of heresy, or sins against the unity of the church. It's a sin against a sacrament as listed in canon law. So it's not even something necessarily that pertains to the unity of the church. So I think that when we look at the historical context and we see, okay, Rome is stringing them along, there's also a lot of violations that the Roman authorities are doing at the same time. He's getting older in age. These individuals have recognized that they're not necessarily the most trustworthy. We've at least gotten on principle that he's supposed to consecrate a bishop. I think that it warrants the necessity to go forward, especially when you're at the end of your life, to go ahead and consecrate bishops. So I think it's valid. And I also think at the same time, when we look at those canons, we can see that he's not excommunicated by the action. And this is why I think something, of course, in the long term, it is a good thing because I don't think any of the Ecclesia Dei institutes would have risen up as a result of that. I don't think Summorum would have popped up as a result of at least the long-term SSPX negotiations. Who knows what would have happened, but long-term, that's why I think it was a good idea.